Oye, que empezamos ya. ¿Me ves? ¿Cómo? ¿Vale? Ah, ni idea.
¿Qué tal? Buenos días a todas y a todos. Mi nombre es Santiago Tejedor, soy el director del Departamento de Periodismo de la Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona y hoy tenemos la gran oportunidad y la gran suerte de contar con uno de los referentes en un escenario y en un territorio muy debilitado en nuestros días, que es el de los viajes, el turismo y la creación de contenidos sobre ambos conceptos. Nos acompañan Javier Zaldúa, director de Geoplaneta, María José Recoder, decana de la Facultad de Ciencias de la Comunicación de la Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona, Laura Chervi, profesora e investigadora del Departamento de Periodismo, y nuestro invitado especial, nuestro gran protagonista, Tony Wheeler, que desde Melbourne, Australia, con una importante diferencia horaria, pues ha accedido a conversar con nosotros sobre, insistimos, un tema decisivo que es el viaje y por qué es importante que lo redefinamos, lo repensemos y, en cierto modo, lo reactivemos en un contexto muy difícil. La idea sería hablar con Tommy, conversar con Tommy, a raíz también de un libro que ha publicado con Geoplaneta, que es este libro titulado En defensa del viaje, una pequeña joya que incorpora las reflexiones que durante el confinamiento Tony realizó sobre su experiencia, pero también sobre la proyección a futuro del sector. Yo quisiera a continuación darle la palabra a Javier Zaldúa para que nos sitúe un poco en la importancia y el perfil de nuestro personaje, de nuestro invitado, pero antes de hacerlo, pues quería, Javier, agradeceros al Grupo Geoplaneta y al sello Lonely Planet que nos ofrecáis esta oportunidad de poder conversar con Tommy y de tener este espacio de reflexión y debate que gracias a vosotros y que gracias a la Facultad de Ciencias de la Comunicación pues nos ha permitido a todos los que creemos en los viajes poder estar hoy aquí y aprender de la trayectoria y de la experiencia de Tony. Muchas gracias, Javier. Te cedo ahora la palabra para que nos ayudes a esbozar un poquito mejor el perfil de Tony. Estamos haciendo la introducción en español. Don't worry, Tony, we are going to talk in English in 5 minutes. It's only the introduction. Javier, por favor.
Muchas gracias, Santi. El agradecimiento es mutuo por nuestra parte y muy buenos días. Soy Javier Zaldúa, como ha dicho Santi, director de la editorial Geoplaneta, editorial que pertenece al Grupo Planeta y que distribuye desde el año 2000 las guías de Lonely Planet en España. Hoy tengo el placer de presentarle a un personaje muy conocido, Tony Wheeler, fundador de la marca icónica y mítica de Lonely Planet, líder mundial en contenidos y guías de viaje. La historia de Tony Wheeler yo creo que es archiconocida, pero está bien repasar. Es conocido como el gurú de los viajeros independientes y el inicio de Lonely Planet empieza en 1972 con un automóvil deteriorado, unos pequeños dólares en el bolsillo y mucha aventura y energía. Eso es todo lo que necesitaron Tony y su mujer Maureen Wheeler para hacer el viaje de su vida. Cruzaron Europa y Asia a través hasta llegar a Australia en el coche. Pasaron muchos meses de viaje y ante el aluvión de preguntas que tuvieron de sus amigos que les preguntaban cómo les había ido el viaje y demás, se decidieron a escribir lo que sería la primera guía de viaje de la futura Lonely Planet, a la que titularon Across Asia on the Ship. Se le conoce como la Biblia amarilla del viajero En tan solo una semana, ellos habían vendido ya más de 1.500 copias y fundaban, o quedaba fundada, la que sería la editorial de guías de viaje más importante del mundo. A pesar de que Tony y Maureen Wheeler se desvincularon de Lonely Planet en el año 2007 y, por tanto, ya no, están al margen de la dirección de la editorial, Tony sigue siendo un viajero incansable y un viajero de referencia que recorre el mundo anualmente dando charlas y realizando interesantes proyectos de colaboración. Menos este año, que este año se ha tenido que quedar como todo el mundo sin viajar. Hoy presentamos uno de esos proyectos de colaboración con Tony, que es el libro que ha editado Geoplaneta, En defensa del viaje, el por qué seguiremos viajando y por qué lo haremos de otra manera. La idea de este viaje nació en pleno proceso de confinamiento, allá por el mes de abril. Nunca el mundo había sufrido, o el mundo del viaje había sufrido siempre desastres naturales, en Japón, en Nepal, tsunamis, actos de terrorismo, pero el mundo del viaje siempre había avanzado. Pero nunca como este año, una pandemia que ha puesto a todo el mundo en lockdown, como dicen los ingleses, ¿no? Completamente confinados y el mundo se ha parado, ¿no? La idea de este libro nació así. Después de esta pandemia global que ha cerrado fronteras de todos los países, Tony Wheeler nos viene a despertar nuestra conciencia como viajeros. Es obvio que debemos proteger nuestra salud, pero también no podemos olvidar que viajar está en el ADN del ser humano. El viajar nos ha convertido en un ser humano más inteligente, más empático, más educado y más solidario. Hemos guardado nuestros pasaportes, muy bien no sabemos cuándo los vamos a poder utilizar, pero ahora es el momento de recordar todas las cosas buenas que los viajes han aportado a nuestras vidas. Y sobre todo es el momento de pensar cómo podemos mejorar el mundo del viaje, hacerlo más sostenible, más respetuoso y más sensato. El libro que presentamos hoy es una mirada personal del propio autor, Tony, al mundo tal y como soy. El autor nos muestra un poco de luz sobre el futuro de la industria del viaje, que reivindica la importancia que ha supuesto viajar en la humanidad. En definitiva, es un libro que nos anima no solo a viajar de nuevo, sino a viajar mejor, siempre y cuando podamos viajar. Pero, ¿cómo saldremos de esto? ¿Volveremos a viajar? ¿Será seguro viajar? ¿Cuándo podremos volver a viajar? Es la gran pregunta que todos nos hacemos. Yo creo que es mejor escuchar a Tony Wheeler, que hoy lo tenemos aquí, y que él nos dé su visión como viajero de referencia que es y como autor del libro de Geoplaneta. Muchas gracias a todos y cedo la palabra a Santi Tejedor.
Muchas gracias, Javier. Le damos paso a nuestra decana, a María José Recoder, para que pueda cerrar este espacio introductorio y a continuación iniciaríamos la conversación con Tony. Buenos días, María José. En primer lugar, agradecerte que nos facilites y apoyes en esta oportunidad, a ti y a todo tu equipo en la facultad. Gracias por permitir estos espacios que son decisivos, más hoy en día que estamos confinados y cuando el verbo viajar se ha convertido pues casi en un verbo prohibitivo. Adelante, María José. Insisto, muchas gracias.
Buenos días, good afternoon. Para mí es un placer dar la bienvenida a todos los asistentes. Hay más de 100 participantes en esta conferencia en nombre de la Facultad de Ciencias de la Comunicación de la Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona. Permítanme que empiece agradeciendo al señor Tony Wheeler que haya aceptado compartir sus conocimientos con nosotros. Thanks a lot, Mr. Wheeler. It's a pleasure to meet you, even it's online. También, sobre todo, agradecer a Santiago Tejedor y a todo su equipo del Departamento de Periodismo y Ciencias de la Comunicación la cantidad de iniciativas que llevan a cabo a favor del conocimiento, no solo para estrictamente los estudiantes que puedan tener matriculados en su magnífico máster de viajes, sino sobre todo a unas acciones que son abiertas a la totalidad de los estudiantes y del personal que quiere de la propia facultad y de fuera de ella. Y por descontado, me parece muy importante dar las gracias a Geoplaneta, su participación en este evento, de hecho ser uno de los impulsores, porque me parece que eso demuestra exactamente cuál tiene que ser la colaboración entre la universidad y las empresas y las instituciones. Es decir, la universidad nunca ha de estar encerrada en sí misma porque no tendría sentido, porque su misión es velar para ayudar al buen desarrollo de la sociedad y evidentemente creo que hay una tarea importantísima de transferencia que se tiene que hacer entre la universidad y las empresas. Por lo tanto, agradezco sinceramente a Javier su participación, de hecho sus contactos y la posibilidad de que podamos reflexionar todos sobre el viaje. Yo no he cruzado desgraciadamente Europa y Asia para llegar a Melbourne en una vieja furgoneta como hizo el señor Wheeler. Yo tengo una autocaravana desde hace 22 años que ya hemos cambiado el modelo porque primero ibas con niños y ahora vas sin niños y por lo tanto ya no hacen falta literas, pero desde luego sabe muy mal no poder cruzar los Pirineos, aunque también es cierto que vivimos en un país, no solo Cataluña, el resto del Estado español, que realmente es magnífico y donde podemos hacer mucho turismo interior. El problema es que si nos ponen toque de queda, ni turismo interior, porque nos vamos a tener que quedar encerrados en la autocaravana y no podremos ni ir a tomar una copa en un bar. O sea que espero que todo eso sea un mal trago que estemos pasando, que nos haga a todos un poco más sabios y más responsables también con nuestra manera de viajar. Muchísimas gracias y Santi, tienes la palabra.
Muchas gracias, María José. Y ahora sí, os presento a nuestra moderadora, Laura Chervi, que es profesora e investigadora del Departamento de Periodismo y que nos va a ayudar a desarrollar esta conversación con Tony Wheeler. Laura, welcome. Thanks for your time. And if you want, we can start talking with Tony, that is the most important today. Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you very much. Well, first of all, thank you very much to Mr. Wheeler for joining us. Let me just sum up a little bit what have been said until now. Basically, I will sum up it in 2 words. You have been presented as the sacred cow of travel. And that, I don't want to be disrespectful, but probably it's the best expression. I would say sacred cow more than guru. So the idea, well, first of all, for everybody's listening, if you have any question, please write it down on the chat. So I will read your question. If it's in Spanish, it's okay. I will translate them for Mr. Wheeler. So let's get started. And I'm going to start with an obvious, very obvious question, but I think that it's very important to make this question to the sacred cow of travel. Once again, you have written a book called En defensa del viaje. That means defending traveling. Why should we defend travel?
Because I think travel is so important. You know, it's a part of our economies, wherever we look in the world. I mean, I know how important it is in Spain. It may not be quite so important here in Australia, but nevertheless, it is very important. And for our close neighbors, New Zealand, I think they're in a situation more like Spain, where it is so important. But that's only economically. You know, a lot of people depend upon travel for their jobs, for their income. They're putting food on the table for their children. But it's also the way we communicate in the world. And I'm very worried that we're losing that communication, that without being able to travel and go out there and meet people, we're being cut off from each other. And I think that travel is a way of stopping misunderstandings, that we realize when we travel that we're all human beings, we all have the same interests and needs, and if we don't travel, we don't satisfy those things. So I think travel is a very important thing, but in so many ways, not just for the economy and money and finance and those things, but also for things that are much more important than that. And I really am concerned that due to this pandemic, we may be losing those things.
Exactly. So following up on this, I would really like to know your opinion. Nowadays, there's a lot of reflection or even debate about this idea of traveling without moving. And whenever I hear traveling without moving, I always think about a Jamiroquai song. I am afraid that Jamiroquai was talking about something completely different from this. But nonetheless, this idea of through new technology, you don't need to leave your house. You can visit the Louvre Museum, you can visit Japan without just staying, relaxing on your couch. So what is your opinion on this, technology and travel?
I think it's good and it's bad. I mean, obviously we can see things without going there. We don't have to climb the mountain to look at what the view is from the top. We We don't have to go into the museum to be able to see the pictures. But I think that's only part of it. And I think, you know, I'm very enthusiastic about theatre and live performance. And my wife is a great fanatic even for opera and live music. And sure, you can put the headphones on and listen to the music, but it's not like being in a concert hall and actually hearing the players play live. But watching cinema is terrific. I'm a great believer in cinema. My son is a filmmaker. I have to say, you know, how important that is. But theatre is important as well. And I think it's the same with travel. We can experience travel through Disneyland, through just, you know, doing things artificially, but it is not the same as going there. And I just don't think we're ever going to substitute that actual face-to-face presence with something artificial. Look, we're all happy doing these Zoom meetings. I've done an awful lot of Zoom meetings in the last 6 months, but they're just a substitute for actually meeting people face-to-face. It's not the real thing.
Exactly. Thank you very much. So once again, following up on this, and I add something that has been asked by Santiago Tejedor. How do you foresee, I know that you don't have a crystal ball, and in this moment, we're all like facing this uncertainty and this like very, very unknown future. But how do you think this pandemic will change the future of traveling? And specifically adding to what Santiago Tejedor was saying, to which extent this pandemic will change us for good? That is to say, nowadays, we're all afraid of the other. Before we were afraid of the other in many metaphorical meaning, now we're afraid because of this idea of the mask. Like, I don't want to be among people because there is a possible contagion. So how do you see this? Or how do you think that this can change traveling?
Look, I think it's true that it will change travel. We're not going to go back to the same sort of travel that we had before. And that fear is both the physical fear of the contagion, getting the disease, being infected, but it's also the fear of, you know, being stuck in bureaucracy and having to go through more paperwork and more inspections and more tests and having to be quarantined if you want to go to some place, or when you come back, being quarantined in your own country. So there are lots of different fears that are associated with it. But I think we should also look at the potential upside of this, that when this, you know, pandemic hit us, lots of places in the world, and I know Spain was certainly one of them, was saying, tourism is great, you know, and it does all sorts of good things, but we can have too much of it. We can have over-tourism. There's just too many visitors, and we just don't, we want to be able to experience it. This is our city. It doesn't belong to the whole wide world. And, you know, maybe we need to limit those things. And I hope that one of the things that will come out of this is we will appreciate what a privilege it was to travel, how lucky we were to be able to go to these places. And in some ways, we were treating that privilege with too lightly. We were just thinking any of us can go anywhere at any time, and it doesn't matter about the places we're visiting. They'll just put up with us, that they will suffer the crowds, the congestion, the fact that it's no longer their own city anymore. And I hope that when we come out the other side from this, because we will come out the other side, that we treat travel with more respect.
Very good. Actually, you have touched on a very delicate point specifically for Spain, because as you said, in Spain, we have a lot of problem with over tourism. We are based in Barcelona. Barcelona had this like serious problem. We have entire area of the city that do not belong to the city anymore. They just belong to tourism. And it's true that we have, I don't know if anybody else shared this experience, but in my case, I rediscovered the city. Like La Ramblas, that's like the touristical spot where nobody goes, no local goes, because it's just, you know, a massive entertainment park. Now you can walk La Ramblas, refilling the La Ramblas. So it's very important. So following on this, Tatiana asks the following question. Massive tourism was a problem before COVID-19. After COVID-19, exactly what you were mentioning, what do you think is a good option in order to recover tourism, but without going back to this massive model of tourism?
Well, I don't know. I mean, this is the problem. We don't know how we will come out of this. One of the other places that I've been sort of working with, apart from doing this book, not written by me in Spanish, but certainly translated into very good Spanish. The problem, there are other countries that suffer this same thing. And one of the ones that I've been working with is New Zealand. And they haven't got Las Ramblas, they haven't got a Barcelona where they're overrun. But at a smaller scale, the New Zealanders, they love walking, they've got wonderful walking tracks, and they were feeling there were just too many people on these tracks, that you were constantly bumping into other people, and that they needed to put a limit on this. And this came up, and now, of course, at the moment, they've got no international visitors, and I'm sure they're experiencing the same thing as you're experiencing in Barcelona, but in a different fashion. But there has to be a balance between the two. We need some tourism because so many people depend on it, but we don't need too much tourism. Now, one of the things that has really worried me about this, and there's a contribution in this book by a wonderful Spanish writer, Ana Blancos, about how travel is so important for young people. And I am concerned that, we might come out the other side from this, and if you're wealthy, you'll be able to travel still, that there'll be financial limits, that places will only be open to people who have lots of money. And I think we need to put limits on things, but we don't want to limit it that the only people who are free to travel are the really wealthy. The older people and the young people are cut off from travel. I don't want that to happen.
Exactly. Yeah, I totally agree with the fact that for young people, traveling is so important, and I think we should justify it. So Gemma asks you once again, we know that you don't have a crystal ball, but as a guru of traveling, do you think that we will travel the same way as before? Somehow you already answered. But Gemma asks you something more. How many years do you think we still need before going back to normality, whatever it means on traveling?
I don't know. I was reading today an article in the New York Times, and they were saying, can we see lessons from earlier? Because these things, I hope they don't go on forever. We don't worry about the Black Death anymore. The Black Death devastated Europeans, and wiped out, I don't know what the figure was, a quarter or a third of all the people in Europe. Well, this isn't that bad. It's nowhere near that bad. Or the flu epidemic in 1918-19, which didn't really die out till 1920. And this article in the New York Times was saying it finally died out when 1/3, 1 in every 3 people in the whole world had got the flu. Now, they didn't have any vaccination. They didn't have vaccines. And we're, I hope, getting over this partly by the same way as they did back in 1918 or back in the medieval times, by people getting it and becoming immune to it. But also we are seriously hoping that we will have vaccines and there will be vaccinations against it and it will be stopped in that respect. I'm hoping it's going to start stopping in 2021. Next year, I hope we'll start to see an end of it. But I would have, earlier this year, I thought, by now, by October, we would start to see an end. And yet I look at the figures and the figures are still going up. We're not reaching an end at the moment. And yet there are countries, the one that in Europe that has the worst situation at the moment is your little close neighbor, Andorra, that little tiny country, which I've been to, between France and Spain. And it's got such an amazing infection rate that if they carry on for 2 more years, everybody in the country there'll be nobody left who hasn't had this. And, if the rate goes that high, it has to terminate. So maybe we should all be looking at Andorra and seeing what's happening there. And I haven't looked at their figures today. Are they going over the top? Is it cutting out? And, it has to eventually. We can't And unless people get COVID-19 and then get it again and again, which I don't think is going to happen, it has to end eventually.
Thank you very much. So going back to the idea of, well, to your book and to your prediction for the future, somebody asks about a specific sector that is cruises. Like cruises actually have been the most affected by this pandemic because of course nobody can or nobody wants to travel on a cruise. So what do you foresee? Like will we go back to cruises, or should cruise sector reinvent itself in order to survive?
I think the cruise sector has to reinvent itself. Now, I have been on smaller cruise ships. I'm not an enthusiast for these giant cruise ships that don't go anywhere very often. They go out, they come back. You know, it seems to me totally pointless. And, you know, we should remember that although they were a disaster story, and there were all these cruise ships that had very high infection rates. And I was in Japan at the start of the pandemic when one of the first real pandemic disasters was taking place, the cruise ship that was stuck there in Yokohama. But there were also cruise ships that cruised around and nobody had the virus at all. I know there was one cruise ship that had set off from the Mediterranean, went all the way to Australia and New Zealand, couldn't land there, turned around, came all the way back to Europe, and nobody was infected on that cruise ship. They had real trouble getting their passengers off, but as far as on the ship, they were all fine. So it wasn't 100% necessary. And I know there are lots of people who love cruises. I don't understand it myself, but they do love cruises. And lots of them are very enthusiastic to get back on another cruise ship. So I think they will restart, but I think when they start again, there's going to be much more social distancing. They won't be packing so many people in. There'll be more medical facilities on the ships. There'll be more testing all the time. So it won't be the same as it was before. And of course, you know, cruise ships were so popular because they were so cheap. You got on this ship and it was your hotel, it was your restaurant, it was your entertainment. It was everything in this one small package. And that isn't going to come back. They won't be able to do that so cheaply. And so will cruises become something only for wealthier people? I don't know. It's a problem they have to face. But again, there are so many people who enjoyed using them, it was employment for large numbers of people. I don't know what's going to happen. That's probably what I'll say over and over again. I don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah, that's probably what we all repeat. So once again, you touched on a very important point, like talking about cruising and like massive tourism. And there's a lot of questions here. So allow me to sum them up because there's a lot going like around the same topic. That is, first, do you believe, like talking about massive tourism, do you believe in this like very old debate that somehow confronts travelers versus tourists? And together with this, Nico Menini quotes Lawrence Osborne that in one of these books says, there are no more places to discover due to tourist overcrowding. What do you think about it?
No, I disagree. I don't think that, you know, the world is exhausted at all. And I think this one of the places I point to is not Barcelona, but another city that is regularly used to exemplify over tourism, Venice. You know, but you go to Venice and, okay, St. Mark's Square is overrun with tourists. But if you go just a few canals away, suddenly you find yourself in some church, and it's a beautiful medieval church. And you think, where are the tourists? You know, the tourists are just not there. We were talking just at the start about a tourist conference that a couple of us were at in Rimini just a year or so ago in Italy. And on my way to Rimini last year, I went to Ravenna, this town with a wonderful history and these beautiful ancient churches, very old churches and wonderful mosaics. And it's a beautiful, beautiful city. And I was really surprised how it was not overrun by tourists. I was thinking, why am I so privileged to be here and be in this wonderful Italian city that has so much to see? And I was staying in a very nice hotel, and there were lots of other nice hotels. I was eating very nice food every night. I was drinking Italian beer, Peroni, and Italian wine. It was all wonderful. And I was not overrun by tourists. I was going into a church and I was thinking, this is amazing. Where are these tourists? You know, I should be crowded out because so many tourists have discovered this place. And that wasn't the situation. And you go to lots of places in the world. You go to places, you know, there are countries in the world where they still have under-tourism. They would like to have more tourists. I think there are some places in the South Pacific. I've been a couple of times in the last few years to the Solomon Islands. Beautiful islands, wonderful scuba diving, all sorts of beautiful things to see there, and just no tourists. Tourists are very, very, very few in number. So that we're not overrun everywhere. Too many tourists go to the same places, but there are lots of places that tourists don't go to. So no, I don't think our world is exhausted at all.
Very good. Actually, for most of the people that probably don't know Rimini, I think that, I don't know what's your point, but I think that if you agree, but Rimini is possibly one of the examples that you're mentioning of like good managing of tourism. For people that are not Italian, Rimini is Italian Ibiza. There is to say Rimini is very well known for the nightlife, very cheap nightlife, young kids, etc. But it happens, as Tony perfectly pointed out, that Rimini is also an historical place and a beautiful city. So now they're trying to just flip, to change their touristical model from cheap nightlife, party, wild, etc., to a more cultural tourism. And actually you discover that this place has a lot more to offer. So possibly this could be a way. I don't know, what's your opinion on that? Like just changing the touristical model of places.
Yeah, I think we need to. I think we will. I think when I was Lonely Planet was my company, and one of the things we often used to say was, look at something that's 2 streets over. You know, you don't have to be on the same big street where all the tourists are. You just go over 1 street or then 2 streets, and in Venice it's 1 canal, 2 canals. You get away from the crowds. You don't have to be doing the same thing as everybody else. So I think, you know, there's always that solution. You know, it's a big world still. One of the things that's worrying me right now is places where tourism is important, and by taking the tourists away, and I think in particular of Africa, where, you know, why do we get a lot of tourists from Europe? They go to Africa and they go there because they want to see the animals. They want to see a lion in the wild. They want to see the elephants. They want to see these iconic African animals. But for people in Africa, the animals, they don't pay the bills. You know, an elephant is something that walks through your garden and tears up the plants. You know, it's a bad thing. It's not a good thing. But then if you have tourists coming there who are bringing money in because they want to see this wildlife, then they can be a good thing. And of course, at the moment, tourists aren't going to Africa. Africa is one of the places which remarkably has not been as badly hit by coronavirus as, you know, the situation in Africa is not as bad as Europe, not as bad as the Americas, certainly not as bad as South America. And yet there are no tourists going to Africa. Africa has really been totally shut off. But I should be in Africa right now. I was going to Africa in October this year. And, you know, suddenly I'm not going there.
Thank you very much. So I would move to another topic, because most of our audience are either journalists, either travel writers. So they're very curious about like the future of travel guides. So the first question is to sum up what people asked. My generation is the Lonely Planet generation. That is to say, I still rely on the physical guide. I have a smartphone, but I don't care. I want my Lonely Planet that will come back with me, dirty and full of like physical stories to tell. what is the future of the travel guide as we know it in the smartphone era, in the selfie era, in the technological era?
Well, look, you know, there's no question the pandemic has really hit travel guides very, very badly, just like it's hit hotels and restaurants and airlines. You know, it's hit all these things very badly. But the travel guide was having to change anyway, because a lot of people were looking for their information from other sources. And I feel there was a space for both. I mean, I still use, when I'm traveling, the physical travel guides, but very often I'm using them physically, not in paper, but in an electronic form. I wasn't just going online and getting instant information that way. I was still carrying the information with me, because very often you can't get a connection. You're in a place where there's no Wi-Fi, there's no internet connection. You know, you can't get those instant answers. So I'm still a great believer in the travel guide, whether it's in the physical paper form. And I really agree with you. You know, you come back and the book is dirty and the pages have been torn and you've written in the corner of things. That's a wonderful reminder of those trips you made. But it doesn't have to be on paper. It could be electronic as well. So I think there's still room for that. But at the moment, you know, I'm not, you know, I've sold out of Lonely Planet. I'm not running it anymore. But I believe they are facing that problem that, you know, how can you update a guidebook when you don't even know what the situation is going to be next week? You can't write, this is a good restaurant and this is a good hotel, if you don't know if they're still going to be in business. So it's extremely difficult for guidebook writing. One of the things that I was in Socotra, an island in Yemen, when the pandemic took off, and I had to leave suddenly because all the flights were stopping. And I was saying to the other people I was there with, will there be a great guidebook, not a guidebook, but a great travel book written by somebody who has sort of gone off the radar, you know, who's traveling someplace where, you know, things have not shut down, or they're traveling in a different fashion. And, you know, will we in a couple of years' time read this amazing account of people who have just, you know, escaped from our everyday world and have done travel in a totally different fashion? I'm fascinated to see what that story is. I know there are people in the Pacific right now who've gone there before the virus struck, and you know, they can't escape it. They can't get out. There are no flights to get out. Instead of spending 2 weeks or even a month in Tonga, they're spending 6 months on the islands of Tonga. And, you know, I think there'll be an amazing account written of this sort of travel. I'm really looking forward to reading it.
Very good. So somebody very, very provocatively, but I think in a very, very interesting way, says, why do we still need travel guides in an era of influencers? That is to say, nowadays, especially like relating to young people, I want to plan my travel to, I don't know, Japan. I just need to log into my YouTube space, and I will see plenty of influencer people from Tokyo explaining me where to go, what to eat, where to go during the night. Why do I need a professional travel writer?
I'm still a great believer in travel writers, because you go on to these you know, sources of information, and how do you know how expert these people are? Are they somebody who really knows about the local culture, the local food, the local restaurant, or are they just somebody whose brother or uncle or mother or whatever runs the place? And, you know, I'm just saying good things about it because I'm related to them. I don't really, you know. And there's so much other information you want. I mean, travel it's not just eating and seeing things. It's also understanding about the place. And you want someone to explain the politics to. I mean, I've been watching in the last week or two what's going on in Thailand, where the young people in particular, it's far more young people than older people, are saying, you know, this is ridiculous that we used to respect our king. The king was a figure of respect, and you know, it wasn't necessarily a good way they did that respect, but nevertheless he was respected. And then they've got this new king who doesn't even live in Thailand. He lives in Germany, and the Germans are saying, we don't really want him here. He should go back to Thailand. Well, he's not welcome back in Thailand. Lots of young Thais don't want him back at all. They think he is a ridiculous character. You know, if I was in Thailand right now and said, you know, your king is hopeless, I'd be sent off to prison. But the young Thais are saying this. You know, they're in revolt against their monarchy, and I think, you know, that's amazing that they're doing this. But if you didn't know a little bit about Thailand, if you didn't understand a little bit about their history and how they've had these multiple revolutions and the military keeps taking over and then the population rises up and it's flipped over again, you know, that's not information that just comes in over the internet. That's information you have to research a little bit and understand. You know, social media, another country that I've spent a lot of time in over the years, where I was even reading an article about it today. You know, the enormous amount of damage that social media has done in the country of Myanmar, Burma. The people who've been driven out of the country by the military and by Burmese who've been infected by this Facebook misinformation. I think it's really, really bad. I've been to Bangladesh. I've been to the refugee camps in Bangladesh, where these Rohingya Islamic refugees who have been driven out of their country have ended up. And that's a lot of that can be blamed on social media and the misinformation that social media carries on out there. I think, you know, guidebooks are much more reliable sources of information than Facebook. If I had to choose between the two, I would say that guidebooks are good and Facebook is bad.
Thank you very much. And the Thailand story, I don't know why, but sounds very familiar in Spain, by the way.
Yeah, but you've had you've come out of it well, and the Thais have not come out of it well yet. You've done very well in all sorts of ways.
Very good. So before going on with the question, that's somehow impossible to me not to ask you this question. So what makes a good travel writer?
Oh, a good travel writer is someone who has enormous curiosity. They want to know about the place and they want to know everything. You know, a good travel writer, you can have someone who is really, really, really good at the restaurants. They know all about the restaurants, but history, culture, music, you know, I've always said that the travel writers we had, they had to be at the market at dawn. They had to be there seeing, you know, what the market was like, what food people were buying, what was happening at that market. But then they had to be in the nightclubs at midnight. They had to run, and in between, they had to be going to the museums, you know, finding out, going to the sites and so on. They had to have an interest in everything. And I think that's the key thing for a really good travel writer, is having an interest in absolutely everything. That you have to cover all sides of the field, all sides of the game. Even if you're, you know, we had one of our writers who was a terrific writer, and he wrote on France. He really was American, but he really knew France very well. He traveled a lot in France, but he always worried me about one thing, that he didn't drink. He didn't, you know, believe in alcohol at all. And how can you love France without loving wine? You know, you've got to have that glass of wine when it's part of the story of France. And, you know, he compensated for that. You know, if I met him, I would always say what I liked about the wine. But, you know, that's a necessary thing. If you don't, and you don't have to like everything. You don't have to be someone who's really keen on nightclubs, but you have to learn about them. You have to know why people do like them. So I think that someone who's going to be a good travel writer has to have a really wide field of interest.
Very good. And how do you take culture into account? As you say, many people believe, or some people believe, that, for example, Lonely Planet, but many other travel guides, you can tell where the writer is from, right? For example, as an Italian, I'm pretty sure you could understand me. Like, I'm a firm believer of Lonely Planet, but for food, you know, as an Italian, we have this kind of supremacist idea of our understanding of food. Like, what the hell can an American say about food? Come on, get out of here. So how can a travel writer take into consideration the culture? Because it's true, there is an American way of understanding another culture. There is a French way, there is a Polish way. So how can we be objective, acknowledging that objectivity doesn't exist?
You have to bring in the other viewpoints. And, you know, we, as Lonely Planet grew, we brought in more and more viewpoints. And I think, you know, and the Italian one is a very good example that we developed a relationship with Slow Food, the Italian believers that it shouldn't all just be the fast food side of the world. And I think, you know, that was improved in the Italian language editions of Lonely Planet guides, and then that came back into the English language ones as well. So we had those things both ways, and I think the guidebooks, you know, they really have to have both sides, because you are, to some extent, you are writing books for people who don't understand everything, who are outsiders, and they have to be interpreted. Hands have to be held. They have to be shown what the local interest is, but you also need the local experts. So it's really important to have both sides of the story, both the people who are outsiders and the people who are insiders. And I think one of the things I always think is that, you know, it does need both sides. Because sometimes when you are actually in the country and you understand everything because it's part of your life, part of your culture, you never see it from the outside. You never see the problems that an outsider may be facing when they go there because they don't speak the language. I actually worked on our Japan guide once, and I have a few words of Japanese, but not much. And I was there with people who spoke Japanese, you know, even if they weren't Japanese. But I was the outsider, and that was a good thing to be, because you do need to look at a country from an outside point of view as well as an inside point of view. So I think, you know, it's an important point, but you need both viewpoints. But yeah, you know, Italian food is one of the things that's always amused me about Italian food is when I've got Indian friends who like traveling in Europe, and they found, you know, they loved Italy, they loved going there, but really the food was very bland. There wasn't enough fire to it. And, you know, they would say, oh, every now and then we just need to escape from Italian food. We need to sort of step back towards India a little bit. So yeah, there's always two sides.
Thank you very much. So, yeah, we have time. We still have time. So going back to the dilemma of like overcrowding, not overcrowding, too much tourism, too little tourism, Tatiana points out something very interesting. Sometimes people want to keep some place secret because they're afraid this place is getting overcrowded and destroyed by tourists. So do you think we should communicate or expose? I think that expose is a very good word, these places.
I'm sorry, as a travel writer, you always want to expose. You know, your whole thing about being a travel writer is that you're trying to find something that other people don't know about. So, you know, when you find something that's hidden away, you know, what do you want to do? You want to put it out there. And so I'm sorry, but the idea of keeping things secret and keeping things hidden, you know, just doesn't, and, you know, every nationality does that. And some nationalities do it better than others. And you go to Japan and there are these buildings that are, they're not one floor, they're multi-story. They're like the bars that you have in Spain on the ground floor, but they go up and up and up. And a lot of those places are very small. They're only 4 or 5 people. And there's no foreigners in them. They're just locals. And yet if you were there with a Japanese and he took you in and you were suddenly one of the 4 or 5 people in that little miniature bar, you'd be very welcome. The thing is, you're only one in the 4 or 5. If suddenly 4 out of 5 were foreigners every night, then the story would change. So it's a balancing act. You know, you do need to keep things a little bit secret sometimes. If it became totally open, it wouldn't be the place it was before. So they have to be kept secret to some extent. But on the other hand, I don't think in this world today there are any complete secrets.
Yeah, exactly. It's very, very interesting because there's this balance. Like there are a lot of questions like about this, and somebody even talks about the criminalization of tourism. There's this idea that like tourism is always and only seen as like an invasion, etc., etc. Both in Europe and, for example, going back to your example in Africa, they say it is true as a travel writer you need to just expose places, but on the other side there's like many people believe that there is a risk with the tourism invasion to just somehow harm the culture, harm the environment.
Yeah, look, that is said a lot, but I think, you know, we don't always view how strong cultures are. You know, in France, they very often France is put as the country that gets more tourists than anywhere else in the world, but the French are still French. You know, nobody stops the French from being French. I always look at Bali, which is a country, an island in a country in Indonesia, which I've been to many times. And although, you know, you see these young people listening on their headphones are on and they're riding off on their motorcycles and they're doing all sorts of things that are part of international culture. But at the same time, they still learn their local dances, they still learn the music, they still follow the art, that you can have both sides. And I think there were examples of, and Bali was probably a good example of it, that the art was something for rich people, for royalty, and it was dying out in some respects. And then tourism in some ways regenerated it. And again, it's got to be a balancing act. You can't just turn everything into something only for tourists. But tourists can also be a source of supporting these things. I think we've been talking about Italy, you know, if you go to Italy for the opera, you know, you go to Verona for the wonderful opera in that ancient Roman amphitheater, you know, and it's part of one of the great attractions of Italy. And, you know, Italians love opera. They treat it like football. You know, if you go to an Italian football game or an Italian opera performance, there's lots of similarities. But that also needs tourists. You know, it wouldn't survive just on the Italian enthusiasm at all alone. It's got to have the tourism as well. So I think a lot of these things, you can have too much, but you can also have too little. And I wonder if Barcelona right now perhaps has too little and would like to not get back as bad as it was, but get back a little step forward.
Yeah. Along this line, Angels asked, what do you think that should the role of government be, both on the side of limiting and on the side of ensuring safe tourism? So somebody else already mentioned, do you believe in this idea of, I'm personally even afraid to ask, but do you believe in this idea of the health passport, like having like kind of a pass that says that you're not dangerous?
Yeah, look, I think that's going to come. I think we are going to, pretty much like we have to go through after 9/11, we have to go through increased security and x-rays and being checked, and we're going to go through increased security on health. And, you know, we will carry a health passport. I mean, there already is a travel pass being developed that, you know, will have your stamps to show that you've been tested. And even if we don't believe totally how accurate those tests are, it's a step in the right direction. I think government, you know, you can have too much government and you can have not enough government. And I've seen lots of places in the world where there hasn't been enough government. You know, the government should have been putting in more restrictions and more limits on how tourism operated. And yet and I think, you know, we're probably better in Europe and in the developed world in managing these things. There are places in the developing world where there's just been no government control at all. They've let anything happen. And if somebody wants to build a hotel, well, they build a hotel. And the fact that there are local people there, you know, you just take the beach away from them. And, you know, the local people, their wishes and needs are just overrun. And it's capitalism at its worst, but it's also government not putting enough steps in, being bought out. And I've seen this far too many times. And I think there's lots of examples of where government should step forward, that government has an important role to play, and they don't always play that role effectively.
Yes, absolutely. So we're going back to, and then we can conclude, we have 10 more minutes, just going back, I insist here, we have a lot of travel writers and journalists. What do you think, besides the pandemic and what's going on in this very specific moment, are the future challenges for travel guides?
I think, you know, that we were certainly facing this challenge before the pandemic. The over-tourism challenge was and it was all over the place, and it was in all sorts of different directions. You know, you know what your situation was in Spain, in Barcelona in particular, but it was also, as I say, a situation in New Zealand, where lots of New Zealanders were feeling that the walking tracks were being overrun, that there were too many people walking there. You know, I've seen it in Hong Kong, where people in Hong Kong were saying, you know, shopping is important in Hong Kong, it's part of Hong Kong life, but, you know, there are too many Chinese tourists. The fact that the Hong Kongers are Chinese as well didn't count. These are different Chinese, they're not our Chinese. So, you know, we see that in all sorts of respects. But of course, the other thing with too much tourism is not just over-tourism, too many tourists in one place, just the fact that there was too much tourism in general. There were too many airlines flying too many places. And I think part of that, and you know, you could certainly see it in Europe, was this feeling that it's the weekend, I'll just fly to the other side of Europe. I'll fly there for Friday night, I'll spend Friday and Saturday and Sunday there, and on Sunday I'll fly back home again. And I think there was too much of that. You know, and we have to realize that travel is a privilege and not just a right. We can't just jump on the plane every Friday and fly off somewhere and come back on the Saturday. And you just have to look at, you know, I look on my phone or my tablet at Flight Radar 24, all these planes going back and forth, too many. And I think that when we do regenerate travel, we're going to have to regenerate it in a different fashion.
Yes, I believe you touch on probably the dilemma, because on the one hand, we had, like, as you mentioned, we have been through the democratization, the Ryanairization of traveling, right? That, of course, we know it's terrible for the environment. It created a lot of social, political, and economical implication. But on the other side, it's true that it democratized travel. Like nowadays, exactly everybody, even a young kid, can afford spending the weekend in London, spending the weekend in Paris. So that's possibly like the big challenge. So. And that's probably what we will have to think. That is, say, on the one end, should we go back to travel only for rich people, the grand tour of the Renaissance, or should we go back? So probably that's the challenge. So as last question, one that is very, very interesting, with natural disasters, terrorism, pandemic, etc., have you ever felt afraid of traveling?
No, I've not. You know, I've always felt that it's, you know, good. I mean, there's certainly countries I've been to where I look over my shoulder more and I take more care, and places where you take care in all sorts of different fashions. There are certainly some places where you're more likely to, you know, have your pocket picked or women to have their handbag grabbed. You know, there are places where, in that respect, things are less safe than others. But no, I've never been that worried about it. And, you know, let's face it, we've had, travel has been hit by all sorts of things, but eventually we get over it and we do start to travel again, whether that is, you know, changes by the natural disasters. You know, we don't worry about people stopped going to Thailand because of the tsunami. But after a year or so, they thought, well, it's not going to happen again this year. It won't happen maybe for 100 years. will go back. After terrorist attacks, people eventually do go back. They think, well, this is, if you were there when the terrorist attack happened, you were very unlucky. But it doesn't happen every day. And most people, that is the story. People worry about, oh, will there be will I get sick in this country? Will there be a bus crash? Will this happen or that happen? And 99% of the time, it doesn't happen. People go, they have a wonderful time. They've put some money into the local economy. They've experienced something new. They've learned something about the culture, the food, the music, the museums. They've come back a better person because of it. And they've also, I hope, done some good while they're there. So I hope that, for all those reasons, that tourism and travel will come back, but it won't come back immediately, and it won't come back the same way it was before.
Very good. Thank you very much. So we should go towards the end. So first of all, thank you very much. It was a great pleasure. Thank you very much to you. Thank you very much to the participant, because we have a lot of answers still. I'm sorry, we need to close. So as a closing statement, we have talked about the importance of travel, etc., etc. So I allow myself to act as a groupie now. And I believe that I shared this with Santiago Tejedor. We are fans of yours, so allow me to be a groupie and ask you, since you're the sacred cow of travel, could you suggest one destination that for you is something that absolutely everybody should visit? Just a place.
Oh, well, I'd come to Spain immediately. If I could jump on my magic carpet and come back to Spain. And the thing, I've traveled a reasonable amount around Spain. But, I have never walked the Camino Santiago, and it's on my wish list. And so maybe next year, if things reopen, I'll come back to Spain, and you can find me walking to Santiago Compostela. I'll be there with all the other pilgrims, getting my little book stamped, and I would love to do that. So yes, Spain is calling me.
Thank you very much. Really, it was a pleasure and an honor. I give back the word to Santiago Tejedor, and thank you very much again.
Thank you.
Okay.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Tommy. Thank you very much, Laura. Muchas gracias a todas y a todos por vuestra participación. Ojalá este sea el inicio de un ciclo de reflexiones sobre el viaje y el viajar. Si así fuera, pues agradeceríamos encarecidamente el acompañamiento y el apoyo, como hemos tenido hoy, de la Facultad y de Geoplaneta y Lonely Planet. Por lo tanto, Javier, agradecerte, ¿no? que hayáis hecho posible este encuentro con Tommy, que sin vosotros pues no hubiera sido una realidad. Y sin duda, como comentaba nuestra moderadora, quedan muchos temas por reflexionar, quedan muchas inquietudes. Y bueno, nosotros en la universidad nos gustan mucho las preguntas, es el motor que nos hace seguir hacia adelante, aunque hemos de confesar que en este tema nos gustaría tener un poquito más de respuestas, un poquito más de certezas. No va a ser así, por lo tanto vamos a tener que seguir interrogándonos, preguntando y buscando a gente como Tommy que nos ayude a ir esbozando y dibujando el camino. Javier, te doy la palabra rápidamente antes de dar paso a la decana, que cerrará el acto, para que puedas aportar un poco tu reflexión final. Y de nuevo, insisto, muchas gracias.
Pues nada, muchas gracias, Santi. Muchas gracias, Laura. Fantástica entrevista que le has hecho a Tony. And thank you very much, Tony, for your masterclass that you gave us today. You have maintaining all the principles of Lonely Planet, what Lonely Planet has been, is now, and it will be in the future. So thank you very much. You are the essence of Lonely Planet. Nada, muchas gracias a todos y sobre todo pues a Santi y a todas las personas que han hecho posible, también a la universidad, a Laura en la organización de este acto.
Gracias, Javier. Y le damos paso a la decana. Tony, we would like to be with you here in Spain. We are going to organize a meeting in the faculty. Don't worry, because if you want, you can take a plane and you can go to Santiago de Compostela in 2 hours, more or less. Okay? But Barcelona is very nice too. Maria Jose, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Wheeler, for your interesting answers. Really, it has been a very, very, very interesting session. Quiero darles las gracias a todos por su participación, a la moderadora Laura Chervi, que ha sido muy incisiva y demuestra tener un gran talento periodístico, y por descontado a Geoplanet con Javier Zaldúa y al Departamento de Periodismo por su colaboración y habernos permitido a todos gozar de lo que ha sido una gran entrevista periodística sobre el viaje, pero también, sobre todo, sobre la vida. Que vaya muy bien y hasta la próxima.
Ok.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Ciao.
Goodbye.
Bye. Bye.
Ciao, Tony.
Thank you.
Safe.
Come and visit us
Bye.
wherever you want.
I will.